We were young until we weren't, but the books stay the same. Rereading our favorite books.
Hello, and welcome to Reread, the podcast where we reread books that we read as babies. And by babies, I of course mean 18 and under, because that makes sense.
Why are you ragging on our format now? We returned to this after so long and you're like, I don't know, this under 18 thing, strange.
You got a problem, buddy? Huh? Do you?
And on this episode, oh boy, we are talking about New Moon by Stephenie Meyer. The second book in the Twilight series, for those who don't know, I guess.
The Twilight saga, for those who do know.
You got a problem, buddy? Huh? Do you?
Oh.
Can you guess which one of us read this at under 18 and which one didn't?
This is, in fact, the first time I ever read this book. It is, in fact, the first time I've ever been exposed to the story of this book, because I've never even seen the movie.
Well, now you have to. Viewing party.
Oh my god.
The movie's a riot.
You know, Morgan, let me
Yes.
tell you a story. So 2 months ago, I had a dream. In this dream, I was walking around the woods of Forks, Washington. It was a little drizzly, a little overcast, but it was a nice day regardless. When suddenly, from behind a tree pops out Stephenie Meyer herself, and she exclaims, Please, Casey, keep reading my books. Keep reading the Twilight saga. And I murmured in response, well, Stephenie, I didn't really care for the first book in your series. Not just because the writing was bad, but I just felt like it was a very shallow treatment of young love, and it didn't really captivate me in any way possible. And then she retorted, this time it's different. This book is so much more mature. Everyone says so. All the critics say so. It's good. Believe me. Please, I've changed. And I mumbled, well, okay, I suppose I can give it a chance. And so I woke up and I started reading this book. And for the first 100 pages or so, it seemed like she was right. Stephenie Meyer in my dreams. I'm like, whoa, this is so much better. There's so much more substance here. I'm intrigued. But of course, as is usually the case when a former lover says they've changed, old habits start to creep back in, old patterns start to reoccur, and you realize the change was just a mirage, and now we have returned to what is familiar. And my God, was I disappointed by this book.
Honestly, I'm just pleased that for 100 pages you were like, oh, actually okay. That's pleasing to me. I feel like that's a real success story. And honestly, I feel like if we were to continue with the series and read the next two books, I feel like it would be similar. I feel like Stephenie Meyer has like real moments of brilliance. Brilliance is maybe a strong word in your view, but like she can be a really solid writer at times, like taking out my nostalgia. And I think that there's certain things that she like can do very well, but certainly like this is getting way ahead of everything. But like, I think Jacob Black is one of her like best characters in a lot of ways, but Jacob goes through some rough times where she really just, he has some of the highest highs and lowest lows of the series. And it's like really fresh. And I feel like New Moon shows a bit of that in terms of like you begin to really fall in love with Jacob, and then things happen, and you're like, oh, no, we've re-entered the teenage toxicity zone. Bad. And actually, you know what? Okay, wait, let me do what I'm actually supposed to do at this point, which is talk about my former experience with this book and how this reread was different or, changed things, whatever. So, I, dear listener, was deeply in love with the Twilight saga at 13 years old. Aww. And I refuse to be ashamed of that. They remain an integral part of my growing as a reader. And New Moon and Breaking Dawn, which is the last book of the 4 books, are both kind of the same for me in that, like, Twilight and Eclipse, I find them, like, better as a whole. But I think that New Moon and Breaking Dawn have, again, that sort of like highest highs, lowest lows thing, where there are just moments in these books where I'm like, this is a great scene or moment or whatever. And then just so many moments where I'm like, no. I think part 2 of Breaking Dawn is arguably one of the best parts of the entire series, if not the best part of the entire series. And in this book, I think that there are, obviously, Twilight is like melodramatic. No one is contesting that, certainly not I. I love the melodrama of it, but I do think there's something about like how Bella's depression is depicted after Edward leaves her that like really resonated with a lot of young readers. And like certainly there were parts of it that like I, as someone who like dealt with depression in my teenage years, did resonate. I think the most iconic part of this book are the blank month pages where there's nothing. It goes like October, there's nothing. You flip November, nothing. December, nothing. That can be what depression feels like, that it's all just this kind of blank, nothing blur of time. And you're just in this morass. And so I think that there's something about Bella in that time period, which, yes, it is. Is it ridiculous that this is happening because a boy broke up with her? Yeah, we understand this is an overreaction, but like, you know what? That happens. Like sometimes that's what gets your brain chemistry like up and it puts you in that place. And like, I think that while the series is melodramatic, there's parts of this book that really get at that. And I think the end of the book with the Volturi, there are some great moments. I've said, I believe in our first episode, that Stephenie Meyer can occasionally write great horror writing. And there's some moments towards the end where you're like, wow, these are, forget the sparkly fun vampires. There's some pretty creepy moments in there. And there is a sense of like our heroes being put in this position where they can't save anyone else. They're barely saving themselves. And it's very tense despite the fact that it's not very action-packed. And I also like the moment at the end where Bella's like, "F you, Edward. You no longer like get to be the final say in what happens to me going forward," and kind of takes charge of her own destiny. Like I said, there's some moments I really like in this book and that I have returned to. But I would say overall, this is the book I've probably reread the least. So like coming back to it this time, I think what really, again, stuck out to me is that I really do like Jacob. I never shipped Jacob and Bella. That was just, I did not see that as a pairing. And I think rereading it this time, and I'll talk about this more later, like gave me more insight into why. But I've always really liked Jacob as a character. And I think that he's a delight to spend time with. And I think it was actually such a like bold move, Stephenie Meyer, to be like, the sequel to my best-selling vampire romance, vampire's going to be out of the picture for like most of the book. This is going to be about this other guy that no one cared about that was in like 2 scenes in the first book. And like, unlike I think a lot of like love triangle books, which again, I still struggle to think of the Twilight love triangle as an actual love triangle. But I feel like unlike a lot of books, this one actually gives Jacob the time that you can, I think, get why people were Team Jacob. Like, I understand that. I think Team Jacob people are valid. That was a really like bold, interesting move that I commend her for taking. And I think to what I really did notice other than those things on this reread, Jacob's 15. I'd forgotten he was 15. I was like, he's a sophomore in high school? He's a baby? Like,
Mm.
I get that, like, Bella's, what, 2 years older? She's 18. But I was like, wait, Jacob is 50? This really blew my mind this time around. I can no longer condone Team Jacob, actually, because he's 15.
You're just a kid! A stupid kid!
Oh, what's 3 years difference in like 10 years from now?
But in high school, that's like 10 years. That's a lot of time.
There were moments that like there's a point where it just seems like the book forgets that these kids are in school, and that's fine. I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just stick to the story that we're telling here and have fun with that. But there were moments where it's like, oh shit, right, these are kids. There's the scene when Bella like goes with Jessica to Port Angeles or whatever it's called, and they go to see a movie, and then they get dinner after, and they're like, we're going to McDonald's. And that took me, that threw me off for a second. Nothing against McDonald's. I love McDonald's, but it just felt odd because in my mind, they had turned into like young 20-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
But in high school, obviously that's where they're going to go for dinner because that's what they can afford. There were times where I forgot, like I didn't feel the age difference in a way that like if there was more of the school setting in this book, maybe you could have felt that distinction between the fact that Jacob is a sophomore, Bella is a senior, Bella is in fact an adult, a legal adult. I wasn't that bothered by it.
I've never been bothered by it before. It was just, I was reading it this time. I was like, wait, Jacob's 15? I'd forgotten this. It was just really one of those things where it's like, it's been 15 years I've been reading these books. And that had never, I've been reading these books the amount of time Jacob Black was alive in New Moon.
Oh my God. But yes, to back up some points that you were making, I too really enjoyed, at least at first, the way that the depression was illustrated, because having gone through major breakups, it wasn't quite as dramatic, but it was, you just fall into that depression and things just kind of sink away from that. And that felt very true. In fact, there were times where I was triggered by this book because it took me back to dark, dark times. But at a certain point, oh man, I really wanted the narrative to move on to other kinds of feelings that result from a breakup and other, I mean, we'll get more into this. We should probably do a summary before.
Yeah.
We.
I shall summarize.
Before we get started on the summary, I do feel it necessary to let everyone know. On this episode, we do talk about suicide, sexual assault, racism, toxic relationships, things that are very serious. But of course, this is New Moon we're talking about. This book has no sense of nuance. So when these subjects get brought up in our summary and discussion, we're usually laughing about them. That is not a reflection on how serious or not serious these topics are, but rather the way this book handles these things. If these are things you're sensitive about, just know that they're going to get brought up. If you rather not deal with it, we'll see you on the next episode of Reread.
As always, I proclaim I'm going to try and keep it short. So we open on, well, technically every Twilight book opens with a flash forward to like the climax of the book, but like I ignore this always because it's not important.
Yeah.
And it was like also a weird, I feel like the YA books were doing that at that point in time. I don't know why that was happening. No one needs that. Don't do it. But we open on Bella having a dream, although she doesn't know it's a dream at first. But it is the night before her 18th birthday. She's basically going to turn into a crone. And so that's what she dreams about. Her turning into her grandma who died a while ago. And Edward, like, still being, like, you know, his youthful, perfect self. And, like, I don't know, kissing her cheek. And she's just disgusted by this idea of, you know, this 17-year-old looking vampire kissing a 90-looking woman. So anyhow, she wakes up in a horrible mood. It's her birthday, and now she's officially a year older than Edward, even though obviously he's actually 90-something. But he was turned when he was 17, so now she's distressed that she is 18 and therefore physically older than him. But everyone else is like, it's your birthday, you should have a nice time. And Bella's like, no, grump, 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 grump. So mad that people have bought her presents. She does not want this to be a celebratory occasion. This is a solemn, tragic moment. We kind of catch up a little bit on what has been, not really, but like basically things have been going well in the Bella-Edward relationship. Other than the fact that she is like, I want to be turned, and he's like, no. And this is just a point of contention between them. But otherwise, they had a great summer together. She's very in love. He's very in love. Yay. So despite Bella's protests, she ends up being dragged to a birthday party at the Cullens' house. I guess before that, I should mention that this book, like all the Twilight books, has a like novel or literary source that it is drawing inspiration from. Actually, that's not true. The first Twilight book doesn't do this, but all the ones after that do. This book is Romeo and Juliet. So therefore, Edward and Bella have to, before she goes to the party, watch the like old version of Romeo and Juliet for school. And they have a whole discussion about whether they would commit suicide if the other person died. A very normal discussion to be having. And Edward's like, oh yeah, absolutely. And like, I did have to think about like, you know, back at the end of the first book, when you were, you know, being attacked by James and I didn't know if I'd get to you in time, I was really, you know, thinking, how am I going to manage this? Because it's kind of hard to kill me as a vampire. So I think what I would do is go to these people called the Volturi in Italy, who Carlisle used to be buds with. But they're like the leaders of vampireness. And I'm pretty sure I could ask them to kill me. And Bella's like,
are you out of your f***ing mind?
If I die, please don't do that. And also, there's a way I could not die and you could not have to think about that. I was like, no. We're planning on suicide at some point down the line. That is the plan.
You really are crazy.
But they let this argument drop for the sake of the birthday party. So they go to the birthday party. And Bella's there for like all of 2 seconds before, we must remember that Bella is extremely clumsy, is like opening one of her presents and accidentally gives herself a paper cut. And a little drop of blood comes out. And Jasper, who is I don't know if he's technically actually the youngest, but he's certainly the least experienced in quenching his bloodlust of the Cullens, smells her blood and is like, rah! And Edward pushes Bella back to get her out of the way. And then he pushes her into a glass table and she breaks it with her arm and then just has, you know, huge amounts of dripping blood.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
All descends into chaos as Jasper is wrestled out of the house, and one by one, the rest of the Cullens must flee because they cannot resist the temptation of Bella's blood. Until it's just Bella and Carlisle, who, if we all remember, is like patriarch of the Cullen clan, definitely the oldest, and a doctor, and just has throughout the years become totally like desensitized to the scent of human blood, and it no longer causes him any issues. He is like extremely zen about it. So they, you know, have a little chat where Bella's like, why is Edward so hung up on not turning me? And Carlisle's like, well, it's because he thinks vampires don't have souls, and therefore if he turns you, he'd be destroying your soul. So this is kind of like an ethical problem for him. Bella's like, but he like has a soul. Carlisle's like, I also agree that Edward has a soul, but like Edward doesn't believe that. And Bella's like, that's stupid. But now she knows this important detail about Edward's hang-ups. So after this, Edward is understandably quite upset because Bella could have gotten killed because she got a paper cut. So he's upset about it and he's moody for a couple of days, but Bella's like, oh, he'll get over it. Like, it is an issue that, like, me being a human, like, is causing a lot of tumult in his family. I get why he's upset, but, like, we'll figure it out. But then he drives her home one day and he's like, here, let's go for a walk in the woods. And she's like, okay, this feels weird, but maybe he's going to tell me, like, we have to run away together or something. Like, it's just, like, too much right now. So they go a little bit into the woods, not that much, literally inside of the house. And he's like, we're leaving. And no one is believing that Carlisle is, like, as old as we're saying he is anymore here. And it's time for us to move on. So Bella's like, okay, I get it. Where are we going? He's like, no. When I say we, I mean me and my family. You are not coming. She's like, but we're in love. Why would I not be coming? He's like, I don't want you to come because I don't love you anymore.
Oh my God.
And Bella's like, well, that changes things. And of course, inside, her heart is breaking. But yeah, so he's like, I want you to take care of yourself, though. Like, just promise me if, like, you have any remaining, like, care for me, you'll look after yourself and not do anything dangerous. In exchange, I will make sure there's, like, no sign left of me. You'll never have to think about me again. I will remove all traces of myself from your life. Bella's basically speechless at this point. She's just like, too much is happening. This is just, like, a lot of emotional devastation hitting at once. So he, like, heads off into the woods to leave her, and she tries to follow after him, but he is a vampire. She is not catching up with this, but she is grief-stricken, and so just wanders around in the woods until eventually she, like, trips on something, falls, and then just doesn't get up, and goes basically catatonic until they send a search party out into the woods to find her and bring her back. And she has saved by one of the men from the local reservation, named Sam Uli. She's brought back, and this is when we get the iconic blank months section. We reemerge to Charlie being like, Bella, I think you should go to your mom in Florida. She's like, no, I can't. I must stay here. He's like, look, I'm really concerned about you. You are like a zombie right now. There is nothing happening in there. I think you need, like, a change of pace. She's like, no, I will not. And so she resolves that she will try harder to pretend like she's a normal person for Charlie so that he won't send her to Florida. So she attempts to go out with her friend, her human high school friend, Jessica, who she's never liked. Let's all be honest and say she never liked Jessica. Even in her internal monologue, she kind of admits that she doesn't like Jessica. But for some reason, she's like, Jessica. Well, the reason is that she thinks that Jessica is such a chatterbox that she'll just fill up the entire time with her words, and Bella will not have to do anything. This is a good time to remind ourselves that Bella's not a nice person. It's important to keep this in mind.
Yes, even if the book doesn't realize that, Bella is an asshole.
Always important to remember that Bella is selfish and self-centered at all times. So, she goes with Jessica to Port Angeles to see a movie, and it's like, what? She's not having a hot time. It's not great. But she's like, I'm doing it, we're existing, blah. Then, in a choice that for some reason Stephenie Meyer decided to double down on, in the first book, Bella was almost assaulted by random men in Port Angeles.
Do you think that's funny, butthead?
As they're walking to McDonald's from the movie theater, or to the car to get to McDonald's, I forget.
Nah, they're walking to McDonald's.
Okay. She sees a guy, like, across the street, and is like, is that one of the guys? I think that's one of the guys. And she decides to go toward him. And as she does this, she hears, crystal clear in her mind, Edward's voice being like, no, don't do that. Turn around and walk away. She's like, oh, hallucinations, hot. Gotta keep going towards this guy. And, so she continues walking towards him and continues hallucinating Edward's voice. She realizes this is not one of the guys, and Jessica finally gets through to her and is like, what the fuck are you doing? Let's go. And Bella's like, I did something that was dangerous, sort of. Edward voice. And she's thinking about how he made her promise to, like, not do anything dangerous. And she's like, why am I keeping that promise? Like, he said he would remove all traces of himself, and he did tear pictures out of my scrapbook. But, like, he couldn't really make it so that, like, I would never have to think about him again. He's not keeping his end of the bargain, so I don't have to keep my end of mine. So, as she's, like, driving around the next day, she sees this, like, pair of motorbikes that are, like, for sale. She's like, that's dangerous. So she gets them, and the person who sells them is like, they don't work. And she's like, that's okay. I know a mechanic. Her father's friend has a son named Jacob Black. She has encountered him before. He's the one who fixed up her truck that she now drives. And she's like, I can take these bikes to Jacob, get him to repair them, and then I will be doing something dangerous and breaking my promise to Edward, which is what I want right now. So she brings the bikes up to Jacob. Jacob hasn't seen her in, like, forever because, again, she's been in Depression Land. And also she wasn't really spending time with him before because, like, she had Edward. What else did she need any other people for? This is also time to remind our listeners that the Edward and Bella relationship is immensely unhealthy, as are most of the relationships in these books. You are not reading this to get a good example of a relationship. That is not the point. The point is toxicity. They literally talk about, like, being addicted to each other like a drug at a certain point. I would actually argue that the books themselves do argue this is not a healthy relationship at various points. They then contradict themselves at other points. But they do explicitly, I believe Eclipse gets the most specific with how unhealthy it is. Like, talk about it in terms of addiction and drugs, extreme unhealthy codependency. No relationship is healthy in these books. So she brings the bikes to Jacob, and Jacob, who has always been just an extremely sunny, happy, cheerful person, is like, Bella, it's so good to see you. She brings in the bikes. He's like, oh yes, we could totally fix these up. I can totally do that. She's like, you know, as payment for your services, you can have the other bike. And he's like, awesome. He is a 15-year-old boy. I must emphasize this. So as she's hanging out with Jacob, she's like, actually, I forgot I really like Jacob. He's a really fun person to be around. He's like not asking her too many questions. He's not giving her any pitying looks. He's just like a fun, cheerful person to be around. She's like, this is nice. I like this, actually. I'm having a good time. So they continue hanging out as Jacob repairs these bikes. And Bella continuously is like, wow, Jacob Black, a fun person to be around. I like this a lot. And Jacob fixes these bikes in, like, record time because he is not doing anything else. He is supposed to be doing schoolwork. He is not doing schoolwork. He, like, very clearly has a crush on Bella and is sacrificing all else to make that happen. So they get the bikes done. They go for their first ride, where Jacob has to teach her how to ride the bike because she has no clue. And as she gets on the bike, she once again hears Edward's voice being like, Bella, don't do this. This is stupid. And she's like, wait, the hallucinations equal me being in danger. I just need to put myself in danger and I can hear Edward's voice. Another reminder that Bella's clumsy. So she begins, of course, every time she rides the motorbike, having to go to the ER because she will do something to injure herself. And Jacob's like, maybe we should take a break so that you don't, like, injure every single part of your body. Bella's like, that's okay. We should do homework. And Jacob is clearly relieved that she still wants to hang out with him outside of motorbike time. Belle has also been sort of making inroads with her old friends at school again. Again, friends is a strong word. She does not like most of them. But she is like, why don't we all do a movie night together? So she, like, organizes a movie night, but it ends up being only Mike, who was one of the high school boys who was into her in the first book, and Jacob, who are able to come. So she's on, like, the world's awkwardest excursion.
Because they both want this to be a date. There's a beautiful moment when they're all sitting together in the movie theater.
Yes.
And she's in the middle, and they both have their arms like resting on the armrest, their hands facing upwards, open.
Yes.
Hoping she'll take their hand. It's so ridiculous. So melodramatic.
It is. I was about to recap that moment, and then part of my brain went, wait, is that a movie only thing? Because the scene in the movie is so iconic, because you have Kristen Stewart in the middle, and she just looks one way, it zooms in on one hand. She looks the other way, it zooms in. It's a really funny moment. I'll break in this recap to say I went a couple of birthdays ago. They were doing a screening of New Moon at my local movie theater. And my sister and I went, and it was all like basically all women our age just heckling the screen the entire time. And it was one of the most fun experiences of my life. And I highly recommend, if there's ever a showing of any of the Twilight movies, in fact, in theaters again. At this point, it's like a Rocky Horror Picture Show sort of experience. But anyhow, moving back. So Mike ends up like puking in the bathroom because he caught whatever the rest of their friends came down with. And Jacob and Bella actually have a full-on conversation about how Jacob's interested in her. And she's like, I don't feel the same way. Like, I'm still hung up on Edward. And he's like, that's okay. I get it. I'll wait. And we can talk about this scene more because I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. It is really great in that, like, they are communicating pretty clearly about, like, what their dynamic is. Yeah. And Bella is, like, saying, I don't feel the same way. And Jacob is, like, pretty mature. Like, he's not angry about that. He's not upset. He understands where she's coming from. He, of course, is still applying pressure by saying he'll wait and kind of putting that expectation on her. So, like, it's not great entirely, but it is, like, at least this moment of sort of, like, release in that it's out in the open. They drop Mike off. They get rid of Mike. And Jacob goes to drop Bella off at her house, and he's like, look, I'll make you a promise. Like, I'm never going to, like, ditch you like Edward did. I'm always going to be here for you as a friend. Whatever happens, me and you, we're solid. That means a lot to Bella. But then Jacob's like, oh, I'm kind of feeling weird. I think I need to go home. I might be getting sick too. And she's like, oh my God, yes, absolutely, go home. Jacob pieces out. And then Bella gets sick with whatever it is, so she's out of commission for a day, so. I should now mention a running background plot that I've been ignoring, which is that weird stuff is going on the reservation with Jacob's friends. That Sam guy who rescued Bella in the beginning, Jacob hates him because he's building, like, a gang. He, like, has a few other guys who are, like, suddenly, like, will randomly be super tight with him. Like, they never talked to him before, and then all of a sudden, they're doing everything together. And this happened with one of Jacob's best friends, Emery. And so Jacob's like, I don't know what's going on, but now, like, Emery won't talk to me. And the way that Sam and his gang are, like, looking at me, it's like they think I'm going to be next. So, like, Bella gets out of her illness, and she calls Billy back, Jacob's dad, and is like, hey, how was Jacob doing? Obviously, I want to hang out with him. He's my best friend ever, so, like, want to check whether he's okay. Billy's like, oh, he's still really sick. And this goes on for a long time. Like, Jacob is really sick. They're talking about it, like, being mono or something. Bella's like, mono? I thought that was just from kissing. So then eventually she susses out Jacob is not sick anymore. Jacob is avoiding her. He's totally okay. He's hanging out with other people. Charlie's, like, seeing him out doing stuff. Have I mentioned that Charlie's Bella's dad, or have I just been talking about him like he's Bella's dad? Who Bella refers to as Charlie, which I will never get over. It's so funny. But, like, Bella's obviously very hurt about this, but she also kind of gets it. She's like, okay, I guess maybe it was, like, just too much for him to, like, have these feelings for me and not have me reciprocate them. Then she finds out that Jacob's been hanging out with Sam, and she's like, oh, Sam got him.
Oh my God.
So, like, she tries to, like, confront Jacob about this, and he's like, oh my God. She is really being aggressive about trying to see Jacob. Like, Billy has tried to stop her. She's like, no, I'm seeing Jacob. And Jacob's like, we can't be friends anymore. I'm sorry. Jacob's also totally changed. Like, he used to have this long, flowing, beautiful hair. He's chopped it all off. He's like somehow gotten even taller. He's giant. He's like 6'5". He's 15.
And he's built, baby. He's got like a 10-pack, bulging biceps.
Yeah. He's 15. This doesn't come up until the next book, but I'll just say it now. Jacob reveals at some point that, like, the magical transformation process he's been through that I'll get to in a second means that he's, like, physically aged 25 now. And I just think that's uncomfortable. That's,
what?
Knowledge none of us needed to know. Yeah, there you go. Now you know.
Huh? What?
Yeah.
We'll get to that in the next book, then. My goodness.
Anyhow, so Bella is like, what the is going on? She's like, Charlie, I think Jacob might have been forcibly brought into a gang. But then that night, Bella is awoken by someone trying to get into her place. Oh, wait, I missed a really important part.
You did miss a very important part.
Somewhere in this, during her, like, what the is going on with Jacob time? The whole time Bella and Jacob were hanging out, they came up with other activities to do besides the motorbike. And one of them was trying to re-find the meadow that Bella used to go to with Edward. Jacob doesn't know this part. He just knows it's a meadow that Bella went to that she doesn't know how to get back to. So during the time he's avoiding her, Bella is like, I'm going to continue searching for the meadow without him. This is a little bit of a risky move, as giant bears have been spotted around Forks, and there have been some dead hikers. Charlie's like, maybe don't go hiking, Bella. Bella's like, I love danger. Peace out. So she goes, and she actually finds the meadow. She does it. Huzzah for Bella. But who does she find there? Laurent.
I'm sorry, but am I supposed to know you?
He was part of the trio of vampires who ran into the Cullens at the end of the last book. He was with James and Victoria, who were a mated pair, and James decided it would be fun to try and kill Bella. So the Cullens killed James.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
Victoria fled. Laurent had already been like, I don't want to be part of this, so I'm going to go visit, like, the Cullens' vegetarian vamp buddies up in Alaska. So Bella sees them, and she's like, oh my god, dude, it's you! I thought you were in Alaska. He's like, well, I was. Like, I really had a great time. But, you know, it's really hard. Like, their diet, it's a real struggle. This is when Bella realizes that his eyes are red, which, like, in vampire terminology means that he is absolutely drinking human blood, because veggie vamps have golden eyes. She's like, oh! And he's like, hey, so where are the Cullens? And she's like, around, just, you know. They had to go, but, you know, they check back in here all the time. He's like, really? And he's like, you know, this is actually great for you. Because Victoria, I remember Victoria. Yeah, she wants to kill you brutally. Like, she sent me here to scout how protected you are, to see if she would be able to kill you brutally. And, you know, if I eat you, I'll make it quick and painless. That would be so much better for you than, like, whatever Victoria is going to do. But I was like, I don't love this, but I guess I'm going to die here because, what can I do? And that is when what emerges from the woods? Not a giant bear, but a giant wolf. Giant russet wolf.
5 of them, to be precise.
Well, first one comes out.
Okay.
Then the rest of them emerge. She's like, run, wolf. She's like, this vampire is going to murder these wolves. But then Laurent's like, holy shit. And dips. She's like, why is he running from wolves? Like, that's weird. And this is when the rest of the wolves emerge and they chase him. And she's like, that's crazy. My life was just saved by these wolves. Wild. Now she lives in fear because she's like, Victoria is going to hunt me down, or Laurent's going to come back. I got vampires after me.
Please, these
vampires.
They're trying to murder me.
So that night when she hears, you know, someone trying to get in her room, she's like, oh my god, I'm dead. I just need to, like, not scream so that Charlie doesn't investigate so I don't get Charlie killed. But it is not, in fact, Victoria. It is Jacob Black.
Holy cow.
Here to be like, I don't want to abandon you. I swore I wouldn't, and I don't want to break my promise, but there are things I can't tell you. But the thing is, I've already told you everything, so you just need to remember and put the dots together. That's all you need to do, Bella. And she's like, remember what? He's like, okay. That one time we hung out, like way back before all this, in the first book. And I told you that story about the cold ones. And Bella's like, yes, how I figured out Edward was a vampire. She doesn't say this out loud because she is, of course, keeping the Cullens secret that they're vampires. And he's like, yeah, of course you would remember that part. There was a whole other part. Remember the other part, Bella. She's like, I don't remember anything. I've got nothing. Nothing is happening in this brain. And Jacob's like, oh my God, Bella, please, please. He dips out. She has a dream. That is recreates the dream that she had that night after they had that first conversation, where he told her the stories. But this time, instead of like Edward being there and the reveal that he is a vampire, instead, Jacob's there. And he turns into a giant wolf.
Oh my God.
And she wakes up and she's like, oh, right! The Quaaludes were werewolves! That's what Jacob's trying to tell me. She's like, but they're murdering people. Those dead hikers? Well, if, the Cullens, vampires, can resist murdering people, Jacob should be able to too. I'm gonna go confront him and be like, please don't murder people. So she goes to Jacob. They actually have a very funny conversation. I find it funny. He thinks that she's disgusted by him being a werewolf. She's actually disgusted because she thinks he's murdered people. He has not murdered people. First, she's very relieved that she's okay with him being a werewolf. She's like, yes, I am so chill with the supernatural. This is no biggie. The issue is the murder. And he's like, Bella, we aren't the ones murdering people. The vampires are. We murdered the vampires. She's like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah, that dude who was trying to kill you in the meadow? We murdered him. He is murdered. She's like, wait, really? He's dead? He's like, yeah, we've been trying to chase this other one, but we don't know what she's up to. She's just doing all these weird things. And she's like, Victoria, she's trying to murder me. And he's like,
gasp.
Very important. We must tell the rest of the pack. So we are now introduced to the rest of the pack. Most significantly, Sam, who is the alpha of the pack. This is not relevant to the plot, but I will mention you are also introduced to Sam's girlfriend, who is not a werewolf. But the werewolves accidentally transform when they're really emotional, mostly really angry, and they will transform not on purpose, and this can be very dangerous for the people around him. So Sam's girlfriend has this giant scar on half of her face from when he lost control and transformed. Put a pin in this to talk about all the issues with this. Pin. After this, Jacob and Bella are able to hang out again because she knows, and also he's got to protect her from vampires. So she's just hanging out with Jacob all the time. It's a little different, he's a little angrier. He doesn't have quite as much of the sun's shininess. He's not happy about this rural thing. One of the things he doesn't like is Sam's the alpha of the pack, and when Sam gives them an order, they actually have to obey it. So when he said he couldn't tell Bella, he literally could not physically tell Bella. And Jacob's not thrilled about it, but he does love hunting vampires and getting to protect Bella. These are great things for him. And he's happy that she still is in his life. And Bella's honestly beginning to be maybe I should try with Jacob. It's not going to be the same. I'm still super in love with Edward. But maybe I should give that a shot. So she's kind of contemplating that. Then one of the other big community leaders and a friend of Charlie and Billy's, Harry Clearwater, dies of a heart attack. This, throws the entire reservation into grieving, and the vampire is still happening, so Jacob's really preoccupied. And so one day, Bella's just feeling really shitty, and she's like, hey, how I saw some of the guys do cliff diving earlier in this book? I think I should do cliff diving. It's been a while since I've got some Edward voice action. Let's do it. This is an objectively stupid decision, and it ends up as stupid decisions do. She jumps off, but she didn't account for tides, currents, and maybe she's not the strongest swimmer in the world. So she's just getting buffeted about underwater, drowning. And she's like, well, I guess this is it. She actually fully hallucinates Edward's like whole face. She's like, I am glad this is the last thing I see. But she's saved by Jacob. Woo! And he's like, you massive idiot, why would you do this? She's like, oh, I wanted to go cliff diving. But she does realize afterwards, like, how stupid that would have been. Too. The fact that she did that just to, like, hear Edward's voice, like, that's no way to live. And there are people who would have been really hurt if she had died because of that. Everything that she's done has been so reckless, and she hasn't been considering, like, how Charlie would feel, how other people would feel. And she's like, okay, no more. I'm not going to do any of that dangerous shit anymore. I'm done. I'm just going to try and live my normal life. I'm going to continue contemplating whether I want to try and, like, make my relationship with Jacob romantic. So, like, he goes to drop her off at her house, and it kind of seems like he's maybe gonna go for it. And she's like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready. And then she sees it. Well, technically, Jacob smells it first. He's like, vampire here. And then Bella's like, oh, that is a Cullen car. And Jacob's like, okay, we're still leaving, vampire. And she's like, no, take me back. That's a Cullen car. And he's like, what the If they're back, that means that our, like, whole agreement where we stay on one side of the line and they stay on the other is back in effect. I cannot go with you. Bella, no. Like, come with me. She's like, no. Cullens. Take me back. So he's like, fine. Bella goes in. Who is there? But Alice! Edward's sister. Bella's favorite of the Cullens. Also, infamously, can see the future. Not super reliable. The future changes, it turns out. But Alice is like, Bella, how the are you alive? I saw you jump from a cliff and go into the water, and you never came up. And Bella's like, oh, yeah, I probably would have died, but Jacob saved me, so it's cool, I'm not dead. And Bella's like, wait, does this mean you're leaving? Since I'm not dead, are you leaving? Please don't leave, Alice, please. Alice is like, I will stay a while, it's okay, calm down. So Alice stays for a little bit, but werewolves are not happy about this. Jacob rolls up to be like, we just want to know, like, what the is going on? Are they staying? What's happening? Bella is like, they're not staying. It's just Alice. She's just here for a visit. She's going to leave again. Like, they're kind of like passive aggressively going at each other. And then Jacob's like, I'm sorry. I get they mean things to you. I'm sorry. I didn't want to, like, break my promise again about, like, us being friends no matter what. Bella's like, can I just be friends with Alice and friends with you? And he's like, not really at the same time. It doesn't really. Werewolves, vampires, mortal enemies. I think she literally stinks. She thinks I literally stink. And Bella's like, ugh, this sucks, but yeah. And Jacob's like, well, but she's leaving, so woo. And they're again kind of having a moment where it's like, is he gonna make the move? And Bella's like, I don't know if I'm quite ready for this, but, like, I guess it's happening. When the phone rings. And Jacob is, like, really annoyed because he was, like, definitely about to kiss her. And he's like, what? And the person says something, and he's like, no, he's not here. Someone says something, he's like, he's at the funeral, because he's saying that Charlie is at Harry Clearwater's funeral, which he is. And then he hangs up. And Bella's like, what was that? And then Alice is like, who was on the phone? What happened? And Jacob's like, well, it was the vampire doctor. Bella's like, Carlisle, why didn't you, like, give me the phone? He's like, well, he just asked if Charlie was there, and I said he wasn't, and that he was at the funeral. And Alice is like, that wasn't Carlisle. That was Edward. Rosalie, our other sister, told him about my vision, and now he thinks Bella's dead, so he's going to do the suicide plot. Bella's like, wait, I'm not dead, so we can just tell him that I'm not dead. That will solve everything. And two, why would he be doing the suicide plot? He doesn't love me anymore. Alice is like, no. Girl, you don't understand. He ditched his phone, and he's not going to trust any of us to say you're alive, because we would absolutely lie to him as hard. We would lie with our entire minds, because he can read minds. We would literally just be, like, chanting mantras in our head that you're alive to try and, like, convince him to stop. He is not going to trust any of us. He's not going to listen to any of us. He is on the path to Italy to get himself murdered. There is no solving this other than taking you to Italy and shoving you physically in front of him so he can see that you are alive. And Bella's like, oh my god, if that's what it takes, let's go to f***ing Italy. And Jacob's like, wait. Are you seriously doing this? And Bella's like, yes, 100%, I'm seriously doing this. And Alice's like, wait, Bella, this is really dangerous. Like, we might not walk away from this alive. And Bella's like, do I look like I give a shit? My whole MO is not giving a shit about my own life. And Alice is like, all right, let's go. And Jacob's like, what the f? No, Bella, don't go. And she's like, please take care of Charlie for me. Bye. So Alice and Bella peace out to Italy. There's a lot of time on planes. Actually, I feel like I would give Stephenie Meyer praise for the way that she makes the entire travel sequence feel tense, but also like so long, which is basically how Bella feels the entire time. Eventually, Alice is able to, her visions kind of narrow down to a point where she's like, okay, he's made a decision. They've said that they're not going to kill him for him. So he's going to break one of their rules, the Volturi, so that they have to kill him. And Bella's like, rules? And Alice is like, well, really, just one. You don't expose the whole vampire thing to humans. So Edward's whole plan is to, at noon, in the central plaza of Volterra, which is where the Volturi live, he's going to step out into the sunlight in front of all the tourists and sparkle his little heart out so that then the Volturi have to kill him. He's doing this for maximum drama. I do love that Alice is like, he really went with his dramatic instincts here. And luckily, this gives them enough time to potentially make it and stop him. The other important thing that happens on this plane trip is that Alice is like, look, Bella, I'm getting sick of this whole, like, he doesn't want to turn you thing. I'm honestly thinking of doing it myself. And Bella's like, oh, yes, please turn me. That would be great. And then I can chase after Edward. And once I'm a hot vampire, he'll want me again. Which is really, yep, that's a thing that she does think. Anyhow, so they finally make it to Volterra. Alice is speeding and bribing people and doing all the things. And eventually she's like, okay, it's too sunny. I got to go through the shadows. You got to go straight ahead through the central plaza. Find Edward. He's going to be right like below the clock tower. Go for it, Bella. Bella runs. She finally sees Edward. She's like, oh my God, there he is. He hasn't stepped out yet. Runs, and smacks right into him just in the nick of time, just as he's about to step. And he's like, oh, Bella, heaven is real. They were super quick about killing me. That was like impressively painless. And now you're here and I'm in heaven. Wow, that's incredible. She's like, you're not dead. I'm alive. You're alive. And we gotta get away from the sun. You are too close to the sun. And Edward is like, oh, I am alive and you are alive. And those are definitely the evil vampires who are now like coming up. And he's like, hello there.
Hello there.
Did not step into the sun. So we're going to peace out now. And the two henchmen from the Volturi are like, you're coming with us. And Edward's getting ready to fight them. Alice rolls up and is like, I'm also ready to fight. But then this tiny, petite little girl shows up and she's like, do we have a problem? And everyone's like, no, we don't have a problem, Jane. We're all just going to go back to the Volturi headquarters now. Bella's like, okay, this is weird. I don't know why everyone's respecting this small child. Small child is obviously a vampire and not actually a child, to be clear. Very important that she is in fact not a child for future books. She's just very petite and youthful looking. So they travel back to the Volturi headquarters under the city. And there, Bella meets Arrow, who is one of the three leaders of the Volturi. The other two are there too, but they're not important. But Arrow is a very eccentric man, very enthusiastic about life, very creepy. And he has a special power, as we know. Some of the vampires have special powers, and his special power is that if he touches you, he can read every thought your mind has ever had. Which feels like a lot to me, but it gives him a pretty good sense of everything. He's like, I'm so glad Bella's not dead. We love a love story, and now she's here. So great, so fun. Can I hold your hand, Bella? I just want to see if my power works on you. That's like really important for me to know. That would be really fun. Will you do that? And she's like, okay. Turns out that Bella's special Edward can't read her mind thing also works on Arrow. And Arrow's like, great. I'm totally okay with this. Jane, does your power work on Bella? Edward and Alice are like, no! Because Jane's power, as demonstrated on Edward, cathartic for anyone who wanted Edward to suffer, is causing you to believe that you're in significant pain. So Bella, of course, flings herself in front of Edward and is like, no! Turns out Jane's power also doesn't work on her. So Errol's like, wow, that's incredible. So cool, so cool. But we kind of have an issue. And Edward's like, I don't see what the issue is. We didn't break any rules. We should get to go. And Errol's like, you actually did. Because Bella is in fact a human. And she does in fact know about vampires. So you did break like the one rule. And as long as she's a human, that's an issue. So we do in fact need to kill her. Edward is getting ready to fight them when Alice is like, Arrow, my hand. Gives her hand to Arrow. Arrow's like, ah, I see. It will all be fine and okay because Bella's totally going to be a vampire.
Wait, what?
So they peace out with the understanding that Bella will be transformed into a vampire, but they do have to hang out until it is night because of the sparkly vampireness. And this means that they do get to see, I think, a scene that is very well done, which is one of the other Volturi vampires bringing in a load of tourists and our heroes having to just sit there and listen as like these tourists are led to their death and as the first screams start. Beautiful. So Bella dwells on how horrible that is for like 2 seconds before she's like, oh my God, Edward. He's so perfect. I forgot how perfect he is. I have to keep my eyes open for like every second he's here because he's going to abandon me again because he of course does not love me. So this lasts for like the entire flight back to the US for like her dad being like, Bella, what have you done? And her getting Uber grounded for life. And then Edward having to sneak back in to see her because Charlie's like, you are never setting foot in this house again, Edward. She awakens after having finally slept after God knows how many hours. And Edward is, still there. And she, like, sort of thinks she's dreaming at first, but then she realizes she's not dreaming. But she keeps the dreaming thing going for a while. It's a whole thing. Basically, they're having a conversation where she's like, oh my God, Winner, I can't believe you're here. I love you so much. But please, never try and kill yourself again. I understand that you felt a lot of guilt about me, but, like, if something happens to me, if I, like, trip over a stone and bash my head open, this is not your fault. You do not need to go do a suicide about it. And Edward's like, you're an idiot. I only told you I didn't love you because I thought that was the only way that you could get the clean break you needed. Like, my world is too dangerous for you, and I don't want to turn you. I only said this because I thought that, like, this might be the only way to get you to let go. But I didn't think you would actually believe me. I thought I would have to argue into this. I thought it would take me hours of saying how much I didn't care about you. But no, you were just like, well, that changes things. What the Bella? And Bella's like, well, like, one, you told me that. And two, like, why would you ever like me? Like, I've never gotten this. It's never made any sense. Like, I don't believe you. I don't think you love me. I was like, oh my God, I definitely love you. You're an idiot. Bella's like, okay, it doesn't matter. Because the important thing is, I need to be a vampire now. And I was like, no, you don't. The Volturi, they're totally going to forget about you. It'll take them decades before they check in on you again. Bella's like, decades? Decades? Did you forget that at 18 I am a crone? I cannot last decades. She's like, take me to your family right now. Because this is about them too now. They will also get murdered if I stay human. So we are going to vote about whether or not I get to get changed into a vampire.
Oh my God.
Edward's like, this, but okay. At some point in the journey over, Bella does in fact realize Edward does love her. She's figured it out. Huzzah. So they have a little round table with the Cullens in which they all like vote on whether or not Bella will become a vampire. Edward's whole plan to like keep the Volturi from finding Bella, to keep her not a vampire, is a really stupid plan that I just am not going to relay because it's stupid and it doesn't matter anyways. But basically everyone but Edward and Rosalie vote for Bella to become a vampire. And Bella's like, all right, Alice, let's do this thing. And I was like, oh my God, I don't think that was just like a emergency. Like, I will do it. But like, really, I don't think you want that. And I was like, okay. Carlisle, will you do it? And he's like, well, I definitely can. So we can get that going. And Edward's like, what? Might be a bit of an issue to turn her right now. Charlie is kind of on high alert. Bella, what about you just wait until you graduate? You are a senior, and it is like February or March, so that's not too far out. Then you can turn. Like, that's a very natural disappearing point. She's like, okay, fine. I will give you the however many more months it is. He's like, okay, we're leaving now before anyone else can talk about turning Bella. So he takes her back to her place, and he's like, he is in full scheming mode. Edward's scheming mode, which is something that I always find delightful. I personally love when this man just reveals what an absolute scheming little he is. It's great. He's not good at it, to be clear. Well, occasionally he's semi-decent at it. But overall, he's not a great schemer. But he is, in his heart, a schemer. He's like, okay, so what, other than the turning thing, is there anything else that you really, really want? And she's like, well, I really want you to be the one to turn. And he's like, what would you give me for that? She's like, I don't know. He's like, what about 4 more years? She's like, no, I don't want to be old. I don't want to be in my 20s when you're not in your 20s. He's like, oh my God, that's so stupid. What about, he's like, marry me and I'll turn you. She's like, what the f? Because Bella does not believe in matrimony. As she puts it, it was the kiss of death for Renee, her mom, and Charlie's relationship. So she's like, I don't want to get married. And Edward's like, well, the only way I'm turning you is if we're getting married. So they have now found a new thing to argue about. And now that the whole turning her has been decided. She also does point out, and this is actually a very good Bella point, so I will give her this, that he does actually believe vampires have souls, because his first thought upon seeing her in Volterra was not, oh, Bella's actually alive, but, oh, I'm in heaven, which means that in his deep down subconscious, he does still believe he has a soul and a chance to go to heaven. So anyhow, the book ends with Jacob finally confronting Edward and Bella after he reveals the existence of the motorbikes to Charlie, a betrayal. He is, understandably, extremely upset about the Cullens being back and also Edward and Bella being back together, and he is not shy about showing this. He's like, we are not cool anymore. Bella's like, what the f***? How can you betray me like this, Jacob? Like, why can't we just be friends? And he's like, we cannot be friends. You are with a vampire. Vampires are evil. Also, I'm here to remind you that as part of our, treaty, you are not allowed to turn humans, vampire. That is part of our treaty. It doesn't matter if it happens, like, off our territory. You're not allowed. No turning. Also, you. And so, the book ends with the tension rising between the werewolves and the vampires. Victoria, still on the loose, still out there. And Bella, very grounded because of her motorbikes. The end. That was not short. I'm so sorry.
This is who we are. Our summaries will never be under half an hour again, if they ever were.
I feel like the Chronicles of Narnia, like some of the kids' books ones, like Goosebumps, I think took like 2 seconds.
That's probably true. Anyway, man, I really checked out of the last 100 pages of this book. Basically when Edward came back into the picture. Also, when we got introduced ad hoc to this vampire underground family cult thing, I just don't care for that intrigue, and I'm sure that it becomes a bigger plot point for the next 2 books. That makes me sad because I just find it distracting. But there were moments in this book that I really, really liked, and I would much rather focus on those, at least at first. The initial, after the breakup, as you said, the iconic moment of the months, the blank pages of those months. Personally speaking, I thought it was a little bit gimmicky, but it was effective. The kind of way of capturing the catatonic state, emotional state of Bella. Her struggling to come to terms with her grief was something that also resonated with me. It's very clear that the book is absolutely in love with how sad Bella is and how hurt she is, and it cannot move past that point. And man, it is infuriating because I kept waiting for that moment where Bella would talk about her feelings with somebody, anybody, presumably Jacob, but just anybody. Because I feel like, not to refer to something so trite, but the stages of grief are a thing for a reason. And they speak to people's ability to overcome grief, but also, I think, use those moments as points of reflection about themselves. I mean, after my last major breakup, I ended up writing a big old memoir about it. And it was this incredibly excruciating, but also in a lot of ways cathartic, being able to reflect on that relationship, on myself, on my own wants and needs, on why the relationship failed, on all sorts of things that dealt with me, dealt with my relationships, my friendships, my connections with people. And it was this really invigorating journey that I went on. We never get that here. Bella keeps skirting that conversation. And there are moments where people try to push it. Charlie tries to push it. I believe Jacob says, like, hey, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. And Bella's like, yeah, maybe someday. And it's just like, why not today? For God's sake, move this plot, move these emotions along. Let's reflect on this relationship. That's what's infuriating to me about this book. I know that I said I want to talk about some positives, and now I'm going to be ranting about the negatives, but I cannot. It's so infuriating that there is not an ounce of reflection about the relationship outside of her being like, I'm sad he's gone. Woe is me. Blah, blah, blah. And there were so many different directions that this story could have gone in if it had bothered to dive into her emotions, to dive into the relationship, what she was actually getting out of the relationship. There's a hilarious line near the beginning of the book when Bella and Edward are talking about transforming her into a vampire. And he's like, no, blah, blah, blah. You need to stay human. You need to live a natural life. And when the time comes, you're going to have to die. And Bella has this, oh my God, this line that cracks me up. What was so great about mortality? What a silly thing to say. But imagine a book where she was convinced that she and Ed were going to stay together forever. Yada, yada, yada. And she was convinced that eventually, at some point, before she turns into a crone, meaning she reaches the age of 20, I guess, before that happens, she would be transformed into a vampire and live forever. Now, Edward breaking up with her is so much more than just losing her boyfriend. It's also losing out on this life. It is losing out on immortality. It is losing out on a chance to be on equal footing with Edward, because she keeps bemoaning the fact that she is so hideous and uninteresting compared to Edward. And if she was transformed into a vampire, well, at least she would become this pagan god of beauty. And it just would have been so interesting to see her actually grapple with the fact that her life is not going to look like what she thought it was going to look like. And to ponder more deeply about that and maybe realize, actually, you know what? Maybe Edward had a point about not wanting to turn me into a vampire. Maybe she could have thought more about the relationship and saw the imbalance there and maybe realized, oh, me wanting to become a vampire was less about wanting to be with Edward forever and more just wanting to feel like on equal footing. I'm just spitballing here. Yeah. But you could do something where she thinks with some kind of nuance about her relationship, gives us a chance to jump into that relationship and really consider it for ourselves.
Yeah, I feel like there's a moment or two in the book where she does talk about how losing Edward was not just losing Edward, it was also losing the Cullens. It was losing this whole family and support network she had built. So there is like an acknowledgement that it is not just a loss of him, but yeah, a loss of something greater than that. But yeah, I do think the kind of like underlying thing is she is so entirely unmoored because everything she thought her world was going to look like is suddenly ripped away from her, and she had no agency in the process, and no one respected her enough to even ask her how she would like that process to happen. Edward decides it has to be a clean break, so he tells the rest of her family, or his family, to not see her again and not contact her. And he takes like I said, all those mementos away from her. And she's not consulted in that. It's a really extremely cruel thing that he does. And I do feel like the book at least acknowledges that what he does is extremely cruel. But yeah, I think that part of the issue is if Bella actually started reflecting on their relationship, one, she might start to actually genuinely move on, which is a problem for this book because the book does not want her to do that. And two, like, would have to talk about their relationship and what that looks like you said, actually reflect on the relationship. And their relationship, as previously discussed, is bad. Like, I firmly ship them together. I think they are perfect for each other. But their relationship is not a good or healthy one. I just think that they deserve each other as human beings. I say that with all the fondness in the world. I hate them and I love them. They're great. They're awful people that I adore. Yeah, like if Stephenie Meyer is actually reflecting on that relationship, what does she say? Also, the book sort of wants them to maintain status quo for Eclipse. I think the big change that needs to happen is now Bella has another friend. Actually, this is the big break from status quo. Bella is no longer entirely codependent on Edward and therefore the Cullens. Bella now has another support network. And this is crucial going into the next book and is really the big evolution of this book, is that she now has Jacob, yes, not human friend, but certainly more human in certain ways than the Cullens. And she has now, to some degree, a healthier life structure because she has multiple people she can rely on. Obviously, her relationship with Jacob is tumultuous right now because of the whole vampire werewolf rah-rah. And then she makes that step in the end where she really takes charge of her own destiny after Edward has torn this away from her in the beginning of the book. So yes, there's progress made on those fronts, but I think that the book really wants their relationship to otherwise stay static for the next book, because that's when they do a lot of their like relationship negotiation and actually evolving as a couple. Which, if she had begun to reflect on the relationship earlier, might not have led to the same conflicts coming up in Eclipse as they do. What the author wants to happen is prohibiting Bella's growth on that front. But I agree with you. I honestly think a more interesting version of this book is Bella genuinely beginning to move on.
Yeah.
And then being pulled back into it at the end. That, I think, makes the whole Italy conflict that much more tense, is if she's going into that not like 100%. Like, she's 100% she wants to save Edward. I feel like that's fair. I see her doing that regardless. But I think it would be more interesting if she's going in, like, having gotten over him just the tiniest bit and feeling conflicted about how she's suddenly, like, feeling those feelings again and having a little bit of anger about that. I think that's such a more interesting back part of the book, and I think it's unfortunate. Like, I understand that you don't want Bella to move on too much, but I think, one, it would have made the love triangle stronger, which I think that Twilight deserves to have. I think Jacob, like I said, has a chance to be a real contender for Bella's heart, and I think that the book is undercutting him by not letting her move on from Edward a little bit more and therefore feel what she feels for Jacob a little bit more. Because she's clearly drawn to him. Clearly. And so I wish they had given just that little bit more, and then having her get back together with Edward in the end is not just automatically, of course I will because that's all I want in life, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I'm making the conscious choice. Like, to basically backpedal all my progress. Or not even the conscious choice, but falling back into it almost against her will. I think that's a more interesting version and sets up the more interesting conflict in Eclipse. Because like I said, I never once doubted Edward and Bella. And I mean, I still don't think I would have even with that. But like, it would have given me a little bit more. It would have made it feel like more of a choice.
Even just moving away from feeling sad to feeling angry about it would have made it so much more dynamic. This book is clearly an example of having to kill your darlings. Reading up on this book, there were some choice bits of information that I found. One of the things that I read is that apparently while she was writing this book, she was crying while she was writing all the sad Bella scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is clearly a writer who is in love with the emotions that she's writing onto the page, and she needs to take that step back and be like, but what am I doing here? Like, what's the bigger point of this? And she never did that. Because, there is a chance to use that grief as a platform for not just reflection about the relationship and about herself and Edward, but as a platform of connecting more deeply with Jacob. There's a lot of talk about how Jacob is now her best friend, but even so, she's holding him at a distance. So how genuinely deep is that connection? He's effectively a rebound in this book, and that's about it. And I agree with you. There is so much more potential there for Jacob to be a legitimate love interest rather than just like the way it's framed is Bella is going to settle for this boy. And it's just like, man, really? Like that's what we're doing here? Well, first of all, there's a big issue with this book because it is influenced so deeply by Romeo and Juliet. And if you're going to read this book and dig it, you have to buy the premise that this book clearly buys, that Romeo and Juliet is the greatest love story ever told. Listeners, if you recall our own episode about Romeo and Juliet, we don't agree with that. So that's already a misstep there. But it's so clear that Stephenie Meyer is in love with Romeo and Juliet as a story. There are lines in here where she's like, the reason Romeo and Juliet was a great story is because Romeo and Juliet end up together and they die together. That's what true love looks like. That's what makes it a great story. Not that Romeo goes away and Juliet moves on and marries somebody else. That's not a great story. No one would remember that story. And it's just like, in the context of this book, Jacob's a real person to Bella. And, this gets back to the idea that Bella is a piece of shit. She is treating Jacob like a prop. And there are so many instances in this book where she treats Jacob and others like props. If we gave Bella a heart, some sense of humanity in this book, there's such potential to really dig into the problems of her relationship with Edward. Why it wasn't working. What was wrong with it? I don't know. Arg.
A couple of points. So I'm going to try and keep them in order. Since you brought up the writing of this book, I did want to bring up one thing that I think is significant for both this book and Eclipse about Stephenie Meyer's writing process, which for like this entire series, which is that she wrote Twilight and then she wrote a sequel book. I forget what she called it at that point, but the sequel book is basically what Breaking Dawn is. And then she was like, once she sold the book to a publisher, she's like, wait, I need to go back and like write the middle part essentially. And if I'm remembering correctly, she did not anticipate what would happen with Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
She did not anticipate him becoming as big of a character as he did. And the sad part of New Moon, the part she was crying over, was what she anticipated. She did not anticipate the way Jacob would just kind of like grow as a character. She had essentially the framework of the beginning written and the end written. And then all of a sudden, stuff was happening in the middle that she didn't anticipate. So I feel like there's this one part of Breaking Dawn, which is like my least favorite part of the entire Twilight saga. I think it is a lot of people's least favorite part of the entire Twilight saga. And there's a lot of things for people to hate on. But like, you can clearly feel how Stephenie Meyer did not have an ending for Jacob in her original plan. And so she does a thing that is awful. And I will not speak on it here so that you can go like into the fourth book if we eventually read that and like have your own reactions.
I think you did actually tell me at some point what happened.
Well, it doesn't matter. The point is that I think that part of the issue with the whole Jacob plot, New Moon, and to some extent Eclipse, is that it was not planned for. And the way that Stephenie Meyer ends up having to resolve everything in the end is bad because she was not good at adjusting. So like, I do think that that's part of it too, in terms of Bella's lack of really opening up to Jacob. I think one of the things on this reread that I noticed, you talked about like how Bella is holding Jacob at a distance and using him, and they're supposedly best friends, but like, how much are they actually? I noticed that on this reread because I remembered, this is the book I've probably reread the least. That's not entirely true. I've probably reread the third part of Breaking Dawn the least because I really don't care for it. The point is that like it had been a while since I had read all of New Moon all the way through. And sometimes like in your memory of a book, you'll remember, I think I've talked about this with other childhood books, you'll remember something being longer or more in depth than it actually is in the source material. And that's how I felt about the Jacob and Bella friendship. Like it does get a decent amount of the book, but I was like, oh yeah, they're not really having the conversations I thought they were having. Like they certainly have good moments. And I think that they get along really well. They have an easiness with them. Jacob makes Bella feel lighter, but they're not really having those like more in-depth discussions. And that's part of why I think the scene after the movie is like one of the ones that stands out in my mind for them, is because they're actually talking about their legitimate feelings and like being upfront and open with each other in this way that they're not necessarily doing throughout the rest of the book. Again, I was thinking like Jacob is such a great counter to Edward too as a love interest because he fights for her. Edward the whole time is like, I don't want you in this life. I don't want you to have anything to do with this. And that's why he leaves, right? It's the noble sacrifice, put that in quotes, but that's the trope where like for the love interest, the other person like sacrifices their future with them. And Jacob literally is forbidden to tell Bella anything about what's going on with him. He is not supposed to see her, not supposed to be friends with her. And he's still like, I'm going to keep my promise. I'm going to do what I can to like still be with you. Even though he thinks he's a monster for like what's happened to him, he still is like fighting for Bella. And that's such a great contrast to Edward. And he's still like, but all the men are overprotective of Bella. I mean, like, I get it. She's in a very dangerous world and people are constantly trying to kill her. But like, especially Eclipse is just like, oh my God. The first half of Eclipse is just both Jacob and Edward being awful. And I think it's a great book for that reason. But like, you see the beginnings of it here too, even with Jacob, is that I think he lets Bella have more agency than Edward does for sure, but there's still that like overprotectiveness that is just part of how Stephenie Meyer writes love interests. But like, if he had been given just a little bit more, if Stephenie Meyer had made a little more room in her plans, Jacob could have been such a great counter to Edward. And to some extent he still is. And there is a one scene in Eclipse that I think you will like in terms of Bella actually thinking through what mortality would be in terms of the whole Jacob thing.
It is funny how much you are talking about every other book except this book. I
can't stop it. Sorry, it's so funny. I can't help it.
But I feel like it's fitting. It's just like there's implied things in this book that are never realized. And
yes,
I don't have that knowledge. So it's just a big tease. This whole book is a big tease for things I want to see. And it sounds like you see at least some of that in the next two books.
Not as much as one would want, but yeah.
I do want to back you up and at least acknowledge that they do have a very, well, relatively speaking, a good sense of communication. Like that scene in the movie theater when they are discussing their feelings for each other, the incompatibility of those feelings. That I hear what you're saying about feeling conflicted with that scene, given that Jacob comes in and says, but I'm going to wait for you, girl. But then again, that also I wasn't as bothered by that because that definitely felt like a high schooler kind of thing to say.
Yeah.
It was a nice kind of mix of mature and immature. They're having this like really honest conversation about their feelings, but they're teenagers. They haven't really quite figured out how to talk about these things yet. They haven't really had the experience to realize like saying I'm going to wait for you isn't really smart. But that contrast between Jacob and Edward is very distinct in that regard. And you just see like how much more joy, just how much more loved it seems like she feels than she does with Edward. Like what Edward has going for him is that he's hot. He is a god of hotness. And thank God he's not in this book, because we could finally get away from every other sentence being about how hot he is and how perfect he is. All that bullshit. And we could just have like people talking. Oh my God. For that alone puts me on Team Jacob, just because at least it's not boring.
Yeah. There's like something very telling in how Bella talks about Jacob. She's always kind of describing him as like sunshine. He's like a sun. He makes her feel warm. And you have to remember that, of course, like Edward he feels like stone. He's cold all the time. Physically, he is cold.
And emotionally.
I mean,
which, like, that's fine.
He does. I would say calling him cold is a bit strong. He's definitely more reserved than Jacob, but he like certainly expresses many a feeling to Bella. And I don't think I could call him cold emotionally, but in comparison, sure. Jacob is very outgoing, very warm, very emotional. And then, of course, this gets turned into the awful thing, which is then he gets very angry. But yeah, so I think that's just very telling in terms of how their relationship is. She finds him very soothing to be around, very comforting. It's a relationship where, like, if she had opened up, you could see them really, like, building something real. But yeah, there is that, like, she never goes there with him. And that's sad. I will say that I think my feelings about that movie theater scene are, wait for it, very influenced by how things transpire in Eclipse. I think that the issue with how Jacob is portrayed, and you get hints of this in the like back half of the book, and to transition here into talking about werewolf Jacob, because I think not only does Jacob undergo a physical transformation, he undergoes an emotional transformation. He gets angry. He gets bitter. Basically, they figured out that the Quaaludes are transforming into werewolves again after generations of not doing this because vampires are around. It's like a defense mechanism for their people to be able to like have defenders against werewolves or against vampires. So like he's very much blames the Cullens for what's happened to him. He does not want to be a werewolf. So he's like really upset and starts being, when Alice shows back up and whenever Bella demonstrates she still has allegiance to the Cullens, he's very bitter. He's very upset. I mean, it's like they're in the whole, like, you can't be friends with them and us at the same time, which, like, yeah, I get it. I understand where Jacob's coming from. But he starts veering into some behaviors that are not, like, fully, like, those stereotypical, like, nice guy behaviors, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He has been Bella's friend, and he's been there for her the whole time. And he starts feeling a little bit like he is entitled, I think, to her and like kind of expecting that their relationship is going to go a certain way, getting pushier about it in terms of like touching her. There's a couple of scenes that I mentioned where like she's like, oh, maybe something's happening that I'm not ready for yet. And he's not necessarily checking in. That movie theater conversation is like only what, like a month and a half before this?
Yeah.
If that. So it starts getting a little uncomfortable. I think that's the movie theater conversation. If Jacob had never transformed into a werewolf, I think looks different. But I think because of like some of the things Jacob ends up going through and how that ends up affecting his relationship with Bella, it becomes a little bit more uncomfortable for me in the rearview mirror. Because I feel like in a world where Jacob never learns about the supernatural and the vampires never come back and him and Bella just keep hanging out and he doesn't transform into a werewolf, I think he is chill and does not push things. I believe that. I believe that he's like in that time, like confident and secure enough, feeling good enough about his relationship with Bella that he doesn't need to, or he doesn't feel he needs to. Obviously, he never needs to. But in the world in which he does turn into a werewolf and gets a whole bunch of like emotional issues with it, he does things that start being very uncomfortable for me.
Yeah, I could. I mean, in general, I feel like the way the whole werewolf bit is handled is just so bad. Like the decision, he's basically the Hulk. Anytime he turns angry, he turns into a werewolf. And that decision to make anger as the reason why they transform. And maybe, I don't know, maybe this gets complicated in the next books, but
no.
Okay, great, perfect. So like, let's just acknowledge the elephant in the room. The idea of making like the only people of color in this book turn into monsters as a result of getting angry, that's a little awkward.
And let's not forget that, I mean, it would be bad regardless, but this is not like a made up group of people.
Yes.
Like the Quileute are an actual people. They actually exist. And this is not in any of their mythology. This has nothing to do with them in actuality. Stephenie Meyer was just like, I'm taking this name and I'm using it. And now my books are hugely popular. So, of course, everyone associates that. But yes, having her indigenous characters turn into giant wolves because of rage, and in the case of one person, maul their significant other.
Yeah.
It's really bad and not good. And there are a lot of articles and think pieces about this that you can find from people who are a lot more informed than us. I will hunt down a few of the good ones so we can put them in the show notes. There are nuances that I think that neither of us are equipped to fully talk about. But yes, it was a choice Stephenie Meyer made that she commits to. It gets worse going forward. I think Jacob is a great character. In a vacuum, I love the arc that he goes on except for the end. And I think that there was a potential to write a really interesting and very cool story with him. But it's not in a vacuum. And the implications of everything are bad. And like just demonstrate a lot of just clear lack of thought.
Well, I mean, this whole book demonstrated a clear lack of thought, but you know, in some kind of defense, not really a defense, but like in a vacuum, forget just how racist this whole thing is. There is something to me in those later scenes with Jacob that was somewhat compelling, because obviously he turns into this angry individual. And it's set up that when these people join with Sam, something about their personality changes. That gets established. But you see Jacob struggling at times with that anger, and sometimes breaking through that anger and getting, you see bits and pieces of the quote unquote real Jacob. So the idea of like some kind of supernatural transformation taking place that is changing his personality, and he is like fighting through that to try to continue to be the Jacob he was before, and to continue feeling for Bella the way he did before. And I don't know, there is to me something really interesting in that struggle. Obviously it's never realized in this book, but just the idea of it at least is interesting.
No, I agree. Like I think in a vacuum, Jacob's story is really compelling. I would say I don't think that his personality is changing because of like becoming part of the pack in terms of like It's happening because he's so upset about it. Like, think about it. He's 15 years old. Reminding everyone he's 15.
He's been turned into a 25-year-old man, apparently.
He's been turned into a 25-year-old man. And also, like, he's been conscripted in war, essentially. His body is like, I mean, obviously, werewolves have been a metaphor for puberty for like 5 million years. So, like, there's that. But, like, yeah, his body is out of his control. When they're in their wolf forms, the pack all share thoughts with each other. So he has no privacy anymore. I can't remember if this is revealed in this book or not. Sorry if I just spoiled something from the next book. But yeah, they all share thoughts.
Oh, no, that's in this book. Yeah.
Okay. And Sam can literally give him orders he cannot obey.
Morgan obviously meant to say disobey, but we'll just keep going.
He's a 15-year-old boy. This is like a horrible thing to have happen. And now he has to, like, he's patrolling during the night. He's having to hunt down vampires. Like, yes, he thinks it's cool, that part of it. But, like, he didn't choose any of this. So, like, I think Jacob's rage and disillusionment with the world are so real, and such teenage feelings too. I mean, again, werewolves are a great metaphor for, like, puberty and teenageness in general. So, like, yeah, Jacob's rage makes a lot of sense. This all works. It's out of the vacuum that you're like, but it's racist. This whole thing is just founded in racism.
The book does not help itself, because just any kind of discussion about the indigenous people in this book, it's just not good. It, like, falls either into stereotypes, or it's just, like, thoughtlessly handled and leans into the way Jacob is physically described. It leans on that exotic energy a lot. But yes, it's so frustrating, because there are good reasons for him to be angry. Even just the idea that he is now, as you put it, he's been enlisted into this war that immediately puts him at odds with Bella, because Bella is literally sleeping with the enemy. And it's just like, oh my God, what do you do with that? He's made this promise that he will always be friends with her, but that's completely at odds with his new mission, and also apparently his instinct to just murder any vampires he comes across. Again, that there's such an emphasis on how instinctual this stuff is with the werewolves, and it's just like, oh, great.
Yeah, and I will say some of the worst parts of the whole thing are how you see both Alice and Edward talk about werewolves.
Yes.
Stephenie Meyer didn't realize that was coded. It's so coded. The way they talk about them being, like, dangerous and out of control, and it's very uncomfortable to read. It's one of those things where it's like, it's so uncomfortable. You're like, wait, was Stephenie Meyer at least a little bit aware? And then you remember that there's no way she was at all aware of any of this. But yeah, I think I grieve for Jacob Black all the time. Like, and I guess it is here on this podcast that I come out and I'm like, Jacob Black's my favorite Twilight Saga character. But he's so, there's so many things so horrifically, incredibly wrong with how Jacob is handled, and how overall the werewolves and the Quaalude people are handled. Like, it's really bad. It gets worse. It is so tragic, because there is, as we've discussed, in a vacuum, a great story there. And it just, as soon as you realize, like, all of the social implications, it's bad. Yeah. Sorry, I'm now in my grief. My, flipping pages. This has lasted for 15 years. My grief has lasted. I have no closure.
Oh my God, you haven't been able to move on.
No.
I mean, there is something interesting in the idea of, like, there's a line in here where Bella is, because she, at this point, she thinks Jacob and the others are killing people, and she is grieving that fact, and has this line where she thinks, it was bad enough my best friend was a werewolf. Did he have to be a monster too? And there's, again, this potential great idea looking at being a monster versus being monstrous, because we have two characters in Bella's life who are monsters. There's a vampire and there's a werewolf. These are supernatural monsters, but they're not really monsters, right? There's something to be explored there, especially for Edward. And this is why it's so infuriating. There are like so many half-baked ideas. Saying half-baked is an insult to half-baked things. There are like 16th baked ideas in this book, because it gets brought up how Edward believes that being turned into a vampire, you lose your soul. That never gets touched again. We don't hear why he thinks that. It just gets brought up and it's like, oh, okay. Well, that's an obstacle, but not really, because Edward thought he was in heaven for a second there, so he doesn't actually believe it. Doesn't matter. But if we had a chance to explore that idea, what does it mean to have a soul? Why is that important for like how we see Edward? And then you have that sort of paralleled with Jacob's journey of like turning into a monster. Like that would be so interesting just to see like his life has completely changed now. He is now a monster, and suddenly everything that whatever plans or ideas he had for himself, his future ambitions, for his relationships, that's all just ended. In like a strange way, it's kind of paralleled with what Bella is going through, where her vision of her life is now ended. So you have three characters here whose lives are just completely, it's just pure chaos now for all these characters. They're just spinning. They're spiraling. They don't know what to do with themselves. Their like sense of identity is completely gone off the rails, and they have to like figure it out on the fly. There's an interesting parallel using what's happening with Jacob, using what Edward believes about himself to look at heartbreak, to look at what it means to lose a relationship and to move on. Like, what does it mean to adapt, to fix yourself, to like pick up the pieces and make some sense of yourself again? That is a super cool idea. And we never see it. We never see it in this book.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm glad Stephenie Meyer didn't touch on the soul stuff more. Reminder to everyone, Stephenie Meyer is Mormon. And I'm grateful to her to the extent she is able to keep religion out of these books. Like, shockingly so. It's still definitely there if you really think about certain things too hard. But, like, Bella's not religious. Edward and Carlisle, I think, are the two people who are religious in, like, the entire series. So, like, I will say, like, I very much agree with your point, and I extremely agree with your point about Jacob and his werewolf transformation kind of paralleling Bella in the beginning. His entire life has changed. It's been entirely out of his control. He had no say. And I think there's, like, one scene where they're, like, bonding over what messes they are. And I was like, this is a great, like, you do feel the solidarity between them in that moment. They're both like going through it, and they're just holding on to each other through it. And that is something that really could have been mined further. Alas, 'twas not. But like, I have to say, I'm grateful that the religious stuff was not further dwelled upon.
This is such backhanded gratitude. I love it.
No, honestly, I think that, like, Stephenie Meyer is an extremely religious person, and, like, I think it's really, let's say really cool. Her books have a lot of kind of underlying religiousness if you look too hard, just because that's her worldview, and it's hard for her to get too far from that. But, like, she really, like, keeps it, for the most part, out of her books, you know what I mean? And I think that that's nice. Just because you're a religious person obviously doesn't mean you have to write about religion. Or just because you're not religious doesn't mean you can't write about religion. You're a writer. You can do what you want. And I think I agree that both Carlisle, with his background, and Edward, like, coming from the time period, it makes sense that they both have, like, religious stuff happening. And it also makes sense that Bella's just like,
If Jesus is saving people, I mean, I wouldn't stand in his way.
I feel like it makes sense that Edward thinks they have no souls because you have to remember that Edward is emo boy, who also, it is very funny. I think she like glances at this when she's having the whole thing with you were talking about with Jacob, where she's like, oh, did he have to be a murderer too? And she's like, it's not like with Edward where he went and murdered a whole bunch of people because he was killing bad guys. Because you have to remember that's a whole like 10-year plot in Edward's backstory where he used to eat people.
He used to be Batman.
Yes.
Which is funny because Robert
Pattinson.
Yeah, he did. Anyway.
Yeah.
I'm vengeance.
It was all predictive. Stephenie Meyer is actually Alice, it turns out. But yeah, so it's very funny because then Bella like doesn't examine that any further. The fact that like actually it's very monstrous that Edward set himself up as judge, jury, and executioner. But like I feel like with that all in mind, I also remember Edward hears thoughts and like therefore believes the worst possible things about everyone at all possible times. I believe Edward would believe they don't have souls. I feel like I don't really need that explained to me. I just feel like that is something he would believe as the person he is.
Mm.
So I feel like for me, the Carlisle says that, and I was like, yeah, that checks out. That's Edward. That's my boy. I think it also checks out for me that he doesn't, of course, ultimately in his heart of hearts believe that because he's a hypocrite and it is so funny. At the end of the book where he's like, I was fighting to make it through an hour without coming back to you. I was like, yeah, you suck, man. You're so bad at this. Like he just ultimately, even when he's trying to do what he earnestly believes is the right thing, he will collapse like a house of cards, like as soon as it suits him, essentially. He'll try, but he's ultimately also a really selfish person. There's sorry, I'm going to reference a future book again. Actually, you know what? I'll reference this one. Him being like, he does not want to turn her. Yes, he has now had it brought to his attention that maybe he does not believe there are no souls, but he's still against it. And he hasn't like fully like thought that through yet. So I think he's still living in like no soul land in his conscious mind. And I get that he's trying to stall Bella's transformation, but instead he's like, how can I get something out of this? Instead of being like, I fundamentally will stand on my morals and not turn you because I believe that's an awful thing to do and I will make that stand. He's like, no, if you marry me, I'll do it. As soon as he can get something, he's on board with the turn Bella train. He's like, all right, I will personally make you a vampire. In my mind, that means I will personally be murdering your soul. But if you marry me first, I'll do it. It's so I think he is incredibly internally consistent. Actually, I'll give that for all the characters. I think they're all incredibly internally consistent.
I can't disagree with you there. That doesn't mean it's good, but because the internal states, especially for Edward and Bella, are so infuriating to me. And the fact that they are so consistent is just like, oh my God, I want to smash my brain in. I desperately want this book to be something other than what it is. And I think part of that is that like I've been like weirdly exposed to a lot of different vampire stories. Like I'm low-key a horror fan. I love horror films. And something that really resonates with me about horror is that the horror element, whether it's a monster or just some spooky other kind of element, is that they represent something. They're getting at something. They're getting at some kind of fear or some kind of idea. Not necessarily an allegory, but it's touching on something. So like, I don't know, the OG vampire story, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dracula sort of stands in as what Stoker saw as like the moral degradation of family values, basically. But like there's other things I've seen or read, like my all-time favorite miniseries, Midnight Mass, possibly the greatest miniseries of all time, possibly the greatest TV show of all time, possibly the greatest piece of media of all time, possibly the greatest thing of all time. If I could marry Midnight Mass, I would. I love that show so much, But the way it uses, I guess this is a bit of spoilers, but I'm going to keep it general. That show uses vampirism as a way of exploring religion, faith, and redemption, and hypocrisy, and bigotry, and all these different big ideas. And it's so fascinating the way it looks at those things through this monster, through horror. And this book, I keep coming back to this question of like, what do the vampires in this book represent? What does the horror in this book represent? It seems to be forbidden fruit, this forbidden love. In fact, I don't think we talked about this for our episode on Twilight, but the epigraph for Twilight, which is the most ridiculous epigraph I think I've ever read for a book. It's a Bible verse from Genesis. Here, let me just find it and read it, because it's so funny that she chose this Bible verse of all Bible verses. Okay, here it is. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. So props on her for using the King James Version. Okay, that's like the premise of the vampire, of Edward at least. He's the forbidden fruit. But man, if he's the forbidden fruit, pass. I don't need him. Like, he's just so boring. I don't know. There's just like no edge to that relationship, you know?
Well, and of course, like, it's the forbidden fruit in the opposite of the actual Bible. Like, it's a good, like, spoiler alert. Bella's pretty happy about being a vampire. That turns out to be really good for her.
Oh my
She's
God.
like, wow, this was the right choice. Now everything's perfect and I can live in perfect eternal happiness with my vampire family. So it's like this weird, like, mixed metaphor of like, and if you want a deep dive on like the weird religious undertones in these books, there are definitely people who have talked about like vampirism as a metaphor for many things in terms of like looking at Mormonism.
Mm-hmm.
I generally don't look into those things because, as I said, I'm not generally like interested in that reading, but I've certainly seen a lot of them. But yeah, so it is, the vampires are a weird mixed metaphor. I mean, I think you can see that at least when the werewolves happened, there is a stronger, like we talked about before, is werewolves are just kind of naturally about like growing up in puberty, and like for Jacob, they function in a way that is like very much still that metaphor. In that sense, they feel more pointed. Have I ever really been like, ah, yes, the vampires in Twilight, a metaphor for something? No, I can't say I have. I think they're just vampires. Which, you know, is fine. It is okay to just have vampires. But, like, certainly it does feel like the use of the vampire in particular is because of the, you know, tension that creates between Edward literally wanting to eat Bella and also not wanting to eat her because eating her means she dead. And I mean, I think that's why the vampires in this book, like, obviously a lot of vampires in other mythology or in other stories are able to drink just a little. Not these vampires. One bite, you either vampire or you dead. So, like, I mean, the vampires are kind of a sex thing, but, like, not really. Not 100%. Although it is funny because, like, there's this, it gets brought up in the beginning of the book that, like, Edward only can kiss Bella for, like, a little bit before he's like, nope, I want to eat you too much. Gotta stop.
Tastes like a burger. I don't like you anymore.
And then at the end of the book, they're, like, full on making out. She's like, oh, he's, like, not stopping me. And he's like, well, now that I thought you were dead, I'm suddenly much better about not killing you. Which is just funny. Sorry, I was just like, if you want to track the progression of Bella and Edward's sexual relationship, actually, that's the relationship progression that they've made in this book. He's now more okay with making out with her. That's like the big... Well, and now he's going to stop trying to run away from her. I guess it's the other big one. He's now committed to the Bella train. But part of that is that he's now more willing to make out with her. But I really don't know what these vampires stand for. I mean, I think, yeah, obviously it's to create this forbidden love situation. It's to create this tension between food and person. But I don't think they're like a metaphor for anything.
Yeah, it is. That's the part of the frustration for me, because if you just look at this relationship, outside of the fact that Edward is a vampire, this is a perfectly socially acceptable relationship. Like, no one would bat it. I mean, there's obviously very toxic aspects of this relationship, but doesn't really have anything to do with the fact that Edward's a vampire. God, I just want something more. Even if it's just like, if this book was a bit sexier, but I know that's not going to happen.
Do you? Do you know that, Casey?
Okay, well, I guess I don't know, but in the 2 books that I've read so far, Meyer is clearly just not broaching that. And okay, there is a scene I want to talk about.
Okay.
It's the scene where Bella goes back to Port Angeles and runs into those men.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you thought that was ridiculous, but I actually think there's something compelling. And again, this is probably me like reading the metaphor into the book, or just reading something of significance into the book, because what I find so interesting in that moment is that the book it doesn't explicitly deal with this, but the fact that Edward has left means that Bella no longer has her protector. She is now in danger, not just from other vampires, not just from werewolves, not just from rapists, potential rapists, but just from, wasn't there a scene in the first Twilight book where like a car almost runs into her?
Yes, she almost gets hit by a car.
Yes, so even normal, everyday, mundane dangers, she's now again in danger from all those things. And in a different book, the story would have gotten into that, of just like, oh, she went from thinking, I'm going to become a vampire one day, I'm going to be not only immortal, but basically invulnerable. Nothing will ever be able to kill me, to suddenly like, oh God, everything's now a threat. How does a person respond to that? Suddenly feeling threatened by everything. And I think there is something interesting in the way that Bella suddenly becomes like a thrill seeker and purposely seeks out the danger. I know the ostensible reason is that she hears Edward's voice, and so it's like this hallucinatory thing. She's chasing after the voice. But I feel like in a much more interesting book, it could have looked at that sense of danger that she's feeling and really examined, what is she going, like, is this a way for her to assert control? What's behind the reckless behavior? If she's feeling threatened by all these things, like a perfectly understandable well, not understandable per se, but like one response to that is to dive headfirst into the danger, embrace that danger, and to basically say to yourself, I'm not scared of this. I actually want this. And I am seeking this out. And there's some lines in there that are so interesting. There's one line where she talks about how she's drawn to these men. She can't explain it, but she's drawn to them. And then once she realizes they weren't actually the same men from before, she loses interest because they feel safe to her. There's no more danger. So she loses interest. Whoa, that's some interesting psychology. What do you think?
I want to first say that the reason I think it's ridiculous is not so much the actual scene itself as my continuing criticism from the first book of like random men trying to rape Bella in Port Angeles.
Sure.
I think that is a stupid scene, and therefore the fact that Stephenie Meyer reminds us it happened, I'm like, don't. So that's my critique. I have no issues with the actual scene itself. But like, the interesting thing is that although she notices when she's in danger the first time that she hears Edward's voice, she doesn't fully connect that it's danger that makes her hear Edward's voice until, I believe, her first time on the motorbike. She, like, registers it, and it's what gets the idea of, like, doing dangerous things in her mind. But when she initially buys the motorbikes, it's about breaking her promise. That's the real instigating factor. She's like, why am I keeping this promise? Why am I keeping myself safe for someone who is, like, not here, one, and, like, has broke their promise to me? There's certainly something in that, like, underlying psychology that's like a you. This is the last thing you asked of me. And I think, again, in a better version of this book where she gets angry, like, this would be the anger stage of her grief, right? And, like, there are the undertones of that. Like, it's there if you want to read it because, yeah, she doesn't, when she's on the motorbike and she hears his voice, that's when she clues in that, oh, if I'm in danger, I will hear him. And then it becomes about the being in danger thing. Or it becomes, the being in danger thing becomes about the Edward thing. And yeah, it's kind of, it's a shame because, I mean, I think that part of it is, like, she's been numb for so long that when she has that, like, first dangerous encounter, of course she feels compelled by it. That's broken through her depression. That's something. And, like, as painful as it is, it's different than just being, like, numb to the world. So yeah, there's, like, definitely something interesting about her whole danger spree. I struggle with it a bit because I feel like it's one of those other things where I'm like, yeah, this is super interesting. And I'm glad it is in this series that is a toxic series in general and no one should take for life advice because obviously it's not a good response to a breakup to go try and hurt yourself a lot.
Yeah, you don't say.
Also, like, don't try and commit suicide if you think your partner's died. Just, like, putting that out there. Again, please no one take these books as examples of things to do with your life.
Oh, God.
They're bad.
I wanted to kill you. I've never wanted a human's blood so much in my life.
I trust you.
It's a shame that the initial impulse gets buried so quickly. Because it is a, like, interesting moment of psychological rebellion for Bella that doesn't get really examined after she's like, Edward voice. But she did have that moment of, like, you, Edward, so go for her.
Yeah.
I'm glad she had at least one.
And you know what? Speaking of suicide, so there are 2 points in this book where she is accused of trying to commit suicide. One is kind of more just a dramatic response to what's happening, which is in that moment in Port Angeles when she's talking or approaching the men, and Jessica is like, "Are you suicidal?" And she has this response that she has to inform us as the narrator that it sounded defensive, but she didn't mean it to be defensive, which, like, with the way this book is written, okay, yeah, her word is law. She, in fact, is not suicidal, but it's so, and there's this, the other moment is after she has jumped off the cliff into the water, Alice is like, why'd you try to kill yourself? And Bella says, I wasn't trying to commit suicide. And Alice is kind of like,
you're a liar and you will spend an eternity on this ship.
And then it just kind of gets dropped. It feels like the book is delusional because with the way Bella has been this whole time, she is most definitely suicidal. Maybe she's not, like, consciously suicidal.
Right.
There's this term. I think it's called indirect suicide.
Yeah.
But this idea that when people die sometimes, they're like, the circumstances are a little weird, but you can't, like, confirm that it was in fact suicidal. And it's very much possible that the person wasn't aware that their behavior was suicidal, but, like, there's a recklessness behind the behavior where it's like, oh, like, this person wants to end their life.
Yeah, which is like Bella this entire book. I mean, she just doesn't care really if she dies. I will say I like the scene after the cliff diving where she's actually thinking about how she could have died and like has had a real like extreme near-death experience and actually internalizes the fact that like she does not want to do that and she decides to stop being reckless and all of those things. Which again, if this was a book that has showed more evolution in her grief, this would be like a turning point, you know? The threads are there. If we want to string them together, we could cobble something together, Casey.
Right.
We could fanfiction this.
Oh my God.
But yes, she's got the whole I want to hear Edward's voice thing, but like she just demonstrably doesn't really care about what happens to herself. She's very unbothered by the multiple injuries she gets during the motorbike stuff. That is just collateral damage. She does not care. Her physical form is not what is important here. So I very much agree. I mean, I think that I agree with Bella that she thinks she's not suicidal. But
yeah, like I agree that she also doesn't think she's suicidal, which is why this book so desperately needs her to like have a conversation with somebody where she gets into her feelings and she is confronted for how she's behaving or something, anything to examine herself more thoroughly with more consideration to like what's actually happening in her brain, in her heart, with her entire self. Oh my God. So like, yeah, that scene in Port Angeles, it never gets brought up again. It's clearly this contrived way to introduce Edward's voice in her head, but it could have been so much more. That's kind of all I've got. Like, that's my summary. It could have been so much more. And that's really why it was so disappointing, because like, I know you like Twilight. I know you like the saga. I don't want to take away from that, but like the first book was just like so boring to me. And then this book, there's sparks. There are sparks here. Something interesting could have happened. And I spent so much of my reading experience in like the latter half of this book being mad at Meyer because it just felt like she was taking the cowardly way out. But then I realized it's not that she was a coward. In fact, I think you brought it up. Like, there is something actually kind of really risky and bold in what this book is doing in just getting rid of Edward and telling a story where your heartthrob is not even present. Like, that's wild. I just think she wasn't aware. It just never occurred to her that these things were in the book, were points of interest that she could have explored and done something with, rather than just pitter patter through the status quo, acknowledging some of the emotional grief, but not too much or not going too far into it so as to disrupt her plans. And ugh.
We talked about this with the first book too, that Stephenie Meyer is not the most aware about what's there in her writing. We talked about the first book in terms of she doesn't realize that Edward and Bella are awful. She doesn't know. She kind of actually realizes that a little bit in Eclipse, which is kind of a fun moment. She then tries to be like, actually, they're not awful. Like, I get how you see that they're not, I swear. It's very funny. Yeah. I think I've mentioned that Eclipse is the Wuthering Heights book, and that comparison, I think, fits them a lot better than Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, yes.
Kathy and Heathcliff are a much better match. But, yeah, so she just doesn't quite register, like, some of the undertones of things. But she does write them in, so I do feel like subconsciously, like Bella, subconsciously she knows. You know what I mean? I just feel like there's something there.
What Stephenie Meyer should have done is like basically knocked herself out, or maybe like taken drugs or something, and just started writing and letting the subconscious become conscious and like getting all that out, because there is something there. Maybe some part of her sees it, and it's just like, if you could like pull that out.
I am glad, I will reiterate that I am glad that you enjoyed this better than the first book.
Yes.
I understand why you are frustrated, but I feel like frustration is better than boredom.
Yes.
And I think that you will be so angry at Eclipse. But I also feel like it's a book that has a lot of interesting pieces to it. And I think it's the book where they most acknowledge that they're awful people, which I enjoy. Yeah, I mean, I truly, every day, I'm like, if I came to Twilight in my now time, in my non-youth, 15 years down the road, like, I have no idea how, I don't think it would resonate with me, like, nearly as much now. I think that it's definitely a series that I cannot see clearly. I cannot tell you whether this book holds up outside of my youth. There is too much nostalgia clicked into it. I just can't untangle. Nothing has compelled me to attempt to untangle it, as opposed to like Harry Potter, where I have forcibly untangled it. I feel like as objective as I can be, New Moon has many interesting pieces, has some high highs, has some low lows, has a lot of racism, has really not, again, no examples. This is not a book to base your life off of. Never do any of these things. But like, I really do feel like it is honestly a better book than Twilight. There's something there. That is as objective as I can be.
This book series is your Star Wars. You know, you're just too nostalgic.
It is my Star Wars. It is. I mean, I will say, at least like back in the day, I distinctly remember this conversation. My aunt also read the Twilight saga. And I at that point, I don't think had really, again, I was 13. Let's all remember I was 13. Really distinguished between liking a story and whether that meant the author was a good writer. And so I remember her saying something like that she wouldn't count Stephenie Meyer among like her favorite writers or whatever. And I was like, what? What? Oh my God. Of course. She's got to be my favorite writer because she wrote like my favorite series. Duh. Or she's got to be like a good writer. You know what I mean? And I mean, I can always defend Stephenie Meyer in that I think that sometimes she is a genuinely good writer. She has real moments where I'm like, you really pulled that off. And I will continuously defend her on that front, like from an objective standpoint, because I'm now old enough that I can objectively be like, yes, I get why everyone is so mad about Murmur. I understand everyone's mad about Murmur. I get the criticisms of her writing, but like she has moments of writerliness that she can pull off, and I love seeing her get better at pulling those off throughout the series. I love seeing her grow. I think it's always great to see an author like genuinely improve, because there are authors who don't. Sorry, I was like going somewhere with this and then I lost the thread.
Kind of just like this
book.
No,
yes, Star Wars. I got it. I found it again. I will say, at the very least, I like very much understand everyone who does not like the Twilight saga. I completely understand you not liking the Twilight saga. I think everyone who doesn't like it, please know that I am with you.
Oh.
I am not like the people who think Star Wars is genuinely the greatest series ever made. I have succeeded on that front. But yes, it is my Star Wars in that, like, it is so entangled for me with, like, many other things. It will always be good in my eyes.
Well, that is very mature of you. Perhaps
Thanks.
This book series will be, like, the prequel trilogy for me. Something that's very, very bad, but over time, you start to, like, pick up on some things. So you're like, oh, actually, that's kind of interesting.
Yes. Actually, you know what? The prequel series is a great comparison for this series, in my personal opinion. As someone who, one, came to Star Wars late in life, and two, am now prequels. That's my Star Wars trilogy, I've decided. It is like it in that you're like, demonstrably, this is not good. Are there like bits that are really good? And you're like, oh, wow, you actually just did that. Yes. Are there some very interesting questions and ideas that are raised? And can you envision a version of the story that is like honestly really incredible? Yes, absolutely, 100%. Is that the story you get? No, definitely not.
Well, look.
But it's there.
The prequel trilogy gave us KOTOR 2, which is one of the greatest greatest games of all time. The Twilight saga gave us 50 Shades of Grey.
You cannot put that on the Twilight saga. You cannot. You know what? The prequels also, I'm sure, gave us many shitty things. The Twilight saga gave us a lot of variable quality.
I just keep making Star Wars jokes and you just keep taking them seriously.
Casey, I don't know why you keep trying to do this.
I know. Well, we're spending more time talking about Star Wars. So I feel like that's as good a sign as any that we've reached the bottom of this barrel.
We'll see you in 10 years when I convince Casey to read Eclipse.
I need like 3 years of recovery between books. So
yeah.
That sounds about right.
Won't be anytime soon.
Well, until next time, hasta la vista.
Bye-bye.
Say so. Say so.